What happens when silence becomes the sharpest weapon? When a nameless woman, bound in chains, decides the fire should speak for her. In 1852, on All Saints' Day, a plantation in Louisiana burned to the ground. 3 white men were found, locked in the cellar, burned alive, and the only person left standing was the one they never saw coming. Who was Ruth? Why did she wait? And what did she find in the attic that changed everything? Some stories were never meant to be told. This one refuses to stay buried. The Edene plantation in northern Louisiana stood like a ghost before its time, isolated by swampland and memory, its columns whitewashed by hands that bled, unseen. In 1852, the house had begun to rot from within. Floorboards warped under the weight of secrets, and shutters groaned in the wind like things half alive. The Edians, Horace and his 2 sons, Thomas and Elijah, clung to the crumbling estate with the arrogance of men who believed suffering was inheritance. She was never listed in the ledgers as Ruth in the Edene records. There were names and numbers, both counted like livestock, absent. Those who still speak of her say the name came later, perhaps whispered by another enslaved girl who'd once seen her weep beneath the cypress trees in the house. She was only the girl, the cook, or when Horace drank too much, the one with the devil's eyes. No one knew where she came from. Rumors swirled like dust on the road from Baton Rouge, that she'd been born on a French plantation and taken after a fire, or that she was the daughter of a Haitian conjure woman who died screaming during childbirth. What is known is this: she was purchased, young, too young to speak without trembling, and brought to Edene wrapped in a burlap sack, her hair shaved close, and her wrists already scarred. She worked in silence. Others avoided her, not out of cruelty, but caution. Silence in those parts could be contagious. She moved like smoke when she cooked. The smell filled the house with strange notes: rosemary and burnt citrus, fennel and something bitter beneath. The boys complained that her food gave them bad dreams. Horace called that a virtue. Thomas was the elder, just 17, but already hardened, like river rock. Elijah, 2 years younger, followed him with the blind obedience of the cruel. Ruth served them breakfast, fetched their rifles, cleaned the blood off their boots without question. She was the only one allowed inside the main house after dark, perhaps because she'd once saved Horace's life when a snake slithered beneath his bed, or perhaps because he thought she owed him something more than labor. She slept in a root cellar behind the smokehouse, chained to a wooden post. At night, the rats gnawed the floorboards above her head, and the cold crept in like an unwelcome touch. Sometimes the overseer forgot to unchain her in the morning. Sometimes he didn't forget. One winter, the preacher from town came to bless the land. He spent the night in the guest room and left before dawn, refusing to take his payment. He claimed the house was cursed. When asked why, he only said the girl watches in her sleep. In time, children on the plantation began to call her the Hollow One. She never spoke, but her eyes, wide, sunken, and still seemed to see something the rest could not. A boy once threw mud at her and claimed she made his sister's hair fall out the next day. Another claimed to see her walk backwards at night, murmuring in a language no one knew. These were stories born of fear, yes, but not without substance. For Ruth, if that was her, Nim carried something in her silence that made even the cruel hesitate. But all of this was before the fire, before the chains broke, before the cellar door blocked from the outside, and long before the ash settled over the fields like snowfall from a world that no longer believed in God's cotton fields. Around Edene were vast and cruel, stretching beyond sight like a white ocean of labor. The sun was unrelenting, baking the earth until it cracked, and the wind carried whispers that never truly faded. It was a land built on the weight of broken backs and stolen names, where no prayer reached the heavens without bleeding first. Ruth worked inside the house, But she heard the screams that echoed from the fields. She heard them, even when no one made a sound. Horace Edine ran his estate with a brand of discipline learned from old Southern war stories, and a hatred he never needed to explain. He had once been a sheriff in a smaller parish, a man with a silver tongue and iron fist. When his wife died in childbirth, something in him curdled. He became colder, less concerned with appearances. Whipping grew more frequent. Punishments became rituals. The God he spoke of in his Sunday sermons was a violent God, and he fashioned himself as its emissary. His sons were shadows of him. Thomas, the elder, had his father's cruelty, but none of his restraint. He hunted with a long knife and collected the tails of squirrels and raccoons, which he pinned to the barn wall like trophies. One autumn, he began catching birds and cutting their eyes out so they couldn't find heaven. Elijah followed his brother in everything, even when it sickened him. The two boys viewed the enslaved not as people, but as tools that cried out when broken. Ruth became their obsession. There was something in her silence they couldn't tolerate. Thomas would shout at her, provoke a reaction, throwing glasses and silverware when she failed to flinch. Once he held a red-hot fireplace poker close to her face, his voice trembling with rage and something darker. She did not scream. Her silence deepened, not from fear, but from deliberation. She began to linger in doorways longer than necessary. She watched people when they thought she'd turned away. The other slaves avoided her now, not from cruelty, but from a primal unease. She began to break things, not often, but deliberately. A wine glass shattered in her hand during supper, the stem sliced clean through her palm. She bled onto the white tablecloth and said nothing. Thomas laughed, called her cursed. Horace said she should be grateful to spill her blood for his table. Ruth nodded once and collected the shards herself. Food went strange after that. Bread spoiled within hours. Meat dried out before it could be salted. Wine turned sour. When Ruth cooked, the air filled with smells no one could place. Faintly metallic, sometimes sweet, sometimes foul. No one grew sick, but no one slept soundly either. Dreams became vivid, thick with images of drowning and fire, of mothers calling from beneath floorboards. Elijah began wetting his bed again. He took two, carrying a Bible in his coat, but never opened it. The cellar behind the smokehouse, Ruth's nightly prison, was found one morning with the chain bolt snapped clean. No signs of struggle, no footprints. Horace assumed the storm had done it. But storms do not leave doors wide open or smudge words into the dirt floor. Words not in English, words no one could read. On the 1st of November, Ruth requested to prepare the All Saints' Day supper. A strange request, as it was not a tradition among the Edine, but Horace, perhaps amused, granted it. She asked for wine, real wine and spices. From the locked pantry, she asked for candles, not the usual oil lamps. She asked, finally, for an apron that had belonged to Horace's late wife. It had been kept in a trunk in the attic, untouched for years. Horace gave it to her with a smirk. Dress the part, he said. Let's see what ghosts you can feed. That morning, Ruth walked the perimeter of the plantation. Witnesses said. She paused at each boundary, north, south, east, and west, touching the soil with her bare hands. At the north fence, she left something behind. A bundle of feathers, twine, and bone tied in a perfect, not a warning or an invitation. The house grew quiet that day. No birds perched on the windowsills. The wind moved without sound. Inside, Ruth cooked alone. She locked the kitchen doors. Smoke began to rise from the chimney long before the oven was lit. The other servants were sent away. That evening, she rang the bell for supper herself, a thing she had never done. The table was set with silver. The food, roast pork, spiced yams, molasses bread, smelled rich, overwhelming. The wine shimmered darkly in the crystal glasses. The candles burned too tall, their flames dancing, even without a draft. And Ruth, stood behind Horace's chair, holding a bottle of wine in one hand and a small iron key in the other. No one remembers the taste of that meal, only that the house never heard laughter again. The table was quiet. Horace sat at its head, flanked by his sons, each one dressed in his Sunday best, as if summoned to judgment rather than dinner. The food before them steamed with a richness the house hadn't known in years. Thick-cut pork, glazed with clove and brown sugar, sweet yams, mashed with pecans, black-eyed peas laced with pepper, and cornbread, so soft it nearly collapsed under its own weight. The wine was darker than it should have been, dense and viscous, poured from a bottle with no label. Ruth served without speaking. Her movements were calm, precise. She filled their plates, topped their glasses, lit each candle again when they flickered low. When Elijah muttered that the meat tasted like ash, Horace slapped the back for his head and told him to be grateful. "This is the finest she's ever cooked," he said. Maybe the girls finally learned her place. Ruth met his eyes, then, just for a moment, and smiled. A small thing, a crack in stone. It passed quickly, unnoticed by the others. They ate. With each bite, their voices dulled. Thomas grew silent first, his usual posturing forgotten as he blinked. Slowly, eyelids heavy as iron, Elijah followed, his fork falling from limp fingers to the plate with a dull clatter. Horace took longer. He reached for his wine again and again, as though he could drink through whatever pulled at his limbs. His words slurred, his eyes blurred. "What did you?" was all he managed before his face struck the table. Chin first rattling the silver. One by one, they collapsed. Not unconscious, but paralyzed. Fully aware, unable to move. Ruth collected the plates in silence. She cleared the table, as she always did. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft, ragged breathing of the three men as their eyes followed her. The men dismounted cautiously, rifles slung over shoulders. One called to her. She didn't move. Another approached, gun half raised. She turned slowly, her face stir with soot, her eyes unreadable, not defiant, not afraid, just emptied. They found the bodies in the cellar, Horace and his sons, bound and blackened, their fingers twisted into claws. The door had been nailed shut from the outside, the iron key still hanging from a chain. Around Ruth's neck there was no trial, no inquiry. The facts were as plain as the ashes. 3 white men dead, 1 black woman alive. They didn't bring her to a jail. They brought her to the woods. What happened next never made it into the parish records. The local paper printed a single paragraph. Tragedy at Edian Estate. Fire claims. 4 lives. No mention of Ruth. No mention of chains. No mention of screams behind locked doors. Only silence. But stories endured. Some say she was hanged that same evening beneath an old peon tree, her body left swinging until the crows took her eyes. Others whispered that she vanished before they could touch her, that she walked into the swamp and was never seen again, that sometimes on cold mornings a figure is spotted among the reeds, barefoot, watching the smoke rise from chimneys long since gone cold. In 1937, a photograph surfaced in an attic outside Shreveport. The image was faded, its edges curled with time. It showed an elderly woman standing beside a broken hearth, a rusted key around her neck, one hand resting on an oil lamp. Her dress was simple, her expression calm. On the back, scrawled in pencil, All Saints' Day, 1852. No one could verify the photo's origin. The house in the background no longer existed. The family that found it never spoke of how it came into their possession. They sold it at auction decades later, and it disappeared again. The land where Ed once stood remains barren. Nothing grows there. Not grass, not trees, not even weeds. Locals say the soil is cursed, that fire still lives beneath it, waiting. That sometimes at night the ground smolders faintly, and if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of a match being struck. Ruth was never given a grave. No stone bears her name, but her memory lingers and whispers in soot. In the way fire bends toward silence, her vengeance was not loud. It was not swift. It was the kind that waits, that watches, that burns only when the air is still enough to carry the scream all the way to heaven or someplace darker.